This is lecture 6 for Monday, May 4th for History 321, the French Revolution at Northland College. Today I want to talk about the Enlightenment because one of the contexts, and I talked last time about what Ancien Regime society was like, is different social classes and such. But there's another aspect to Ancien Regime society, which is the world of ideas. And there's a lot of debate amongst historians about how much the world of ideas shaped the revolution, and we could see a little bit of this with Fourier showing up. So I want to talk about the Enlightenment, and in particular I want to talk about Enlightenment political theory. Now, those of you who've had my Enlightenment course, obviously understand this, but I want to just give a brief overview of what the Enlightenment was, okay? So, in a nutshell, the Enlightenment was the attempt to take the scientific method and scientific reasoning that came out of the scientific revolution in the 1600s and apply that to all aspects of society. And the Enlightenment, so in one sense it was an attempt to really expand what we're going to apply science and reason to. But the other aspect of the Enlightenment is that it was when science and reason and these new ideas really became common amongst the educated classes of Europe. So let me back up and explain what all that means. First of all, in the 1600s, 1500s and 1600s, the scientific revolution took place. And what this is basically when scientists in a number of fields, especially biology and astronomy, figured out a bunch of new methods for finding the truth. And by doing these experiments, such as proving that the Earth revolved around the sun and that the mathematical equations could predict the motion of the planets, that they showed that science, in particular the scientific method, could understand the natural world. And in the process, they also showed that the natural world was guided by laws of nature. This was a new idea. Before, in the Middle Ages, it was understood that the natural world operated because God regulated it and kept it operating. And so the understanding was that God tended to work methodically because he was really smart, so he set up a good system and it just continued to work. But God was necessary for keeping the whole system going, and God could change the rules periodically in the form of a miracle if he wanted to. So in the scientific revolution, they showed that really there are just scientific laws. They convinced people that there were scientific laws and that mathematics and human observations could understand those laws, could figure out what those laws were. Okay, now the scientific revolution was earth-shaking in a lot of ways, but it really only involved a couple hundred or thousand people at the most. I mean, the number of people who really understood, what Isaac Newton was doing or what Johannes Kepler was doing was minuscule. And so the scientific revolution sort of offered a model. Here we've made some scientific discoveries, and there were a lot of good scientific discoveries in the scientific revolution. They discovered that blood circulated and the heart pumped the blood through the body. They invented the microscope and the telescope. They figured out how the planets move. They figured out a law of gravity, that sort of thing. So there were a lot of really good discoveries in the scientific revolution, but the scientific revolution was most important because it created a model. It said, here, we've proven by making these cool discoveries that our method can find the truth with a capital T, and that we can understand how nature works and then start to manipulate and control nature. And then so the Enlightenment comes along, and essentially the Enlightenment was when people said, wow, this was really cool, let's try to apply this new scientific method to everything. Okay? Now, the Enlightenment was in some ways very scientific. There were lots of new sciences that came directly out of the Enlightenment, right? Certainly the fields of chemistry and geology were pretty much invented during the Enlightenment and created as scientific disciplines. The field of biology blossomed during the Enlightenment and really was sort of put on the founding principles that it's now founded on. And you can point to lots of other sciences like that. And even older sciences like mathematics or astronomy made significant advances during the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment had a lot of what we would call real hard science. The Enlightenment they also saw the creation of social sciences, right? You could argue that, history, sociology, psychology, economics were all basically founded or created as in their roughly their modern form during the Enlightenment, right? But there was a whole lot also in the Enlightenment where people got excited about these scientific ideas, they got excited about reason, and they didn't quite know how to apply it. And so they basically said, often the Enlightenment just sort of boiled down to, let's wipe away all our preconceived notions and say, we're going to throw out all the ideas we had before about how the world works, and let's just start over from scratch and look at how the world works and try to figure it out. Right? And this was often not scientific. Right? Often this was just people sort of looking around and offering an opinion off the top of their heads and calling it science. Right? But the Enlightenment clearly accomplished a great deal in terms of spreading these new sciences. I mean, if you looked at any given science like chemistry, they identified oxygen and CO2, and they identified the cycle of the CO2 oxygen cycle in the natural world, and they came up with a uniform nomenclature, and right after the Enlightenment, in the early 1800s, they invented the atomic theory of molecular structure, and that's really the foundation of modern chemistry. And so the Enlightenment had a lot of really good science. But there was also a social aspect to it. They thought in the Enlightenment that you could apply science sort of easily to all aspects of life, including human beings and including society. And here's where they started to run into trouble. First of all, it's really hard to do scientific experiments on human beings. And in particular, it's hard to run scientific experiments on societies because you can't run the same society over again, change a couple variables and see what happens. So often in these areas, the Enlightenment was an incubator of new ideas, and it came up with lots of fantastic new ideas, but it was not really doing science per se. And in some cases it evolved into a science such as political science or economics, but often it began as just sort of let's wipe away preconceived notions and let's just try to think about a better way to do it. Right? Now, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, because it claimed to find the truth with a capital T through scientific observation, it came into conflict with the church. And because quite frankly, the church had an explanation for why the world was the way it was, and science didn't agree with that explanation. So they were both claiming to offer the truth about the world. And this could be negotiated. In fact, in many ways, Christianity, the church and the Catholic Church and various Protestant churches have made their peace with science. Other Christian sects have not, but it didn't have to be an open conflict. But for Enlightenment thinkers, when they thought about applying this new science, they saw science as a weapon against the power of the church, especially in France, as against the power of the Catholic Church. And so lots of Enlightenment thinkers tried to use these new ideas of reason and science to poke holes in Christianity in general or in the Catholic Church in particular. And so a big theme of the Enlightenment was, let's attack religion. And I want to point out, the Enlightenment was not a coherent movement in the sense that everybody agreed on everything. The Enlightenment was where they said, hey, let's take all the stuff we agree on now, all the traditions and that, we'll throw it away, and then we'll approach everything rationally. Well, that let people go in every direction. And so there's really, for every question the Enlightenment raised, there were 472 different answers because everybody was trying to come up with their own scientific explanation, and they weren't doing any really good science in a lot of cases. And so for any question in the Enlightenment, you could find a wide range of answers. But that was kind of the point. The Enlightenment was about getting rid of the preconceived notions and then trying to find new answers, new approaches to things. Right? And so attacking religion was a key part of the Enlightenment, but not everybody agreed on this. For instance, there were lots of people who embraced chemistry or geology or some big science, but still thought that didn't challenge Christianity at all, and they could simply continue to practice Christianity and do science at the same time. They saw no conflict. On the other end of the scale, there were people who took Enlightenment ideals and said, this shows that human beings are just biological animals with no souls, and there is no God, and there is no religion, and we have to be atheists, right? And then there's every position in between. People say, well, we can question a whole lot of Christianity. We don't know if there's a God or not, but we should just question Christianity and not believe that, so we should remain sort of skeptical of things. Or there were people who said, Christianity is great, but the Catholic Church has some problems. Or there were people who said, I believe there's a God, but I'm not sure Christianity is right. I don't believe all this stuff about miracles, so I'm going to believe in a God, but not Christianity. So there's a whole range of responses. But one of the other things that was really important in the Enlightenment was that they had a new vision of human nature. In fact, they came up with two new visions of human nature, one of which was too radical to touch right away. So basically, coming out of the Middle Ages, the vision of human nature was that human beings are a soul and a body that are combined, right? And the idea in Christian theology, coming from Augustine, was that since human beings had committed this first sin in Adam and Eve eating the apple they weren't supposed to eat, human beings had had this sort of broken existence where our souls longed to connect to God, and our bodies had all sorts of physical desires and needs like hunger and lust and etc. And our bodies and souls were sort of at war with each other, right? That they wanted different things, and so we were constantly knowing we should strive for God and do holy things, but we were constantly tempted to have sex and eat too much and get angry and be greedy and etc. So that was the Christian model, and I'll get into it in a little bit, but in the medieval world, their whole vision of government was built on that Christian model of humanity. But the Enlightenment introduced some new ideas, and one of the new ideas that the Enlightenment developed was this idea that human beings are actually a biological body, which is pretty machine-like, and then a rational mind, which was separate from the body. Right? This comes out of Descartes. Descartes had this radical mind-body split. The Enlightenment developed that further. And people like John Locke argued that human beings are born as a blank slate, and then they have the ability to reason, but they have no knowledge or information to reason with. And this is not Locke's metaphor, but mine, but they're like a computer that has a fantastic processing system, but no software on it yet. And so Locke argued that over time, human beings get physical experiences, and then they learn about the world through their senses, and then they begin to reason about that, and that shapes their character. Their experiences shape their character and shape what they know. And so this is like putting software on the computer. So that model of human nature comes out, and this model is kind of profound because it means a couple of things. Number one is it means that human beings are shaped by their experiences and their environment. And two, human beings can be perfectly rational. And what that means then is that if society is not perfect, it's not because human beings can't be perfect, it's that we've screwed it up. We've taught people the wrong things. We've given them the wrong experiences, and they're not living up to their full potential. So the way to fix society is simply to have better education and better knowledge, etc. And this will allow us to create a perfect society because human beings are infinitely perfectible. They can be better and better and better because they're shaped by experience. So if you give them better experiences, they will be better people, right? So this is a much more optimistic vision of human nature because it says that you can shape people in positive ways. Now it also implies you can shape people in negative ways. The second model to come out of the Enlightenment is this biological model. And it basically says human beings are biological animals. They are related to apes and squirrels and chimpanzees and whatever. And as biological animals, we are programmed the way biological animals are programmed. And we probably don't even have free will. We are simply programmed by nature, and our behaviors and our thoughts are just shaped by biological processes. And so we really are not anything special at all. That vision was too radical for most people in the Enlightenment. The people who wrote about that vision often got shunned or even thrown in prison. Books about that position got burned or banned or censored. And that idea really didn't take off. It spread slowly through Enlightenment society, but it never became a mainstream idea during the Enlightenment. Those two new visions of human nature evolved during the Enlightenment and emerged from the Enlightenment. Now, given all that, and given the Enlightenment is this big movement to try all sorts of new sciences, to throw away all preconceived notions and come up with a rational new way of organizing society and understanding things, including attacking religion and the Catholic Church, I want to turn now to one particular aspect of the Enlightenment, which is the aspect of political theory. Because the Enlightenment, one of its most profound impacts was to provide a whole bunch of new political theories. Now, some people have argued that the Enlightenment basically caused the French Revolution, that these new political ideas that come out are so radical, they change the way people think about government, and it led people to overthrow the government of France and try to rebuild it. Okay, that's almost certainly entirely too direct, because there were lots of people in the Enlightenment who didn't want to overthrow things. And there's not a direct line in a way we can see that says directly, oh, I read Rousseau, now I want to be a revolutionary. But it's also clear that the language of the Enlightenment showed up in the French Revolution a lot. And so it's clear that Enlightenment thought, in some ways, was shaping the way people thought about what was going on in the French Revolution. So we need to investigate this. We need to find out exactly what is the relationship between the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And you've seen a hint already. I talked about the Furet reading in the commentary on Furet, and I said, Furet basically says the old system collapses, and in the vacuum, people turn to Enlightenment ideals, in particular Rousseau. Okay, so let's talk about this political theory. Let's talk about how political theory emerged in the Enlightenment. The first thing is I just want to go back to medieval political theory. Medieval political theory was fairly rudimentary in the sense that they didn't have a field of study called political theory where they talked about different ideas of government. But people certainly did write a lot about what they thought government was there for and how society should be organized. And it was basically built on the medieval idea of human nature, which is that human beings are fundamentally broken. Their souls want to go one direction and their bodies have other desires and want to go another direction, and so they're constantly tempted by sin. And because of that, medieval political theory tended to say, well, they said a couple things. Number one is at bottom, they tended to assume that government was there to help create a society that would prevent people from sinning. Or to put it slightly differently, society had to be organized to be as holy as possible. And part of that was you had to prevent people from sinning. And so when they talked about politics, medieval thinkers tended to start from the position that God had organized society the way he wanted it. God had set things up a certain way because morally he wanted human beings to act certain ways, and he had set up society to encourage that. And so medieval thinkers would talk about society as a body that was organized with each part fulfilling a specific function, and each person had to fulfill the function that had been assigned to them. And so men and women were different, and they had different functions to fulfill, and they shouldn't question those functions, they should simply fulfill them. And peasants and aristocrats had different functions to fulfill, and they were different, and you shouldn't question that. And the metaphor here was taken from the Bible, that, what if the foot wanted to be the head? The body wouldn't work anymore. A foot has to be a foot, because that's what it's made for. So peasants have to be peasants, that's what they're made for. Women have to be wives and mothers, that's what God made them for. This was the idea in the Middle Ages, was that God had assigned everybody to a position. And in addition, medieval political theory thought that God had put a group of people who were better able to control things, the aristocrats, in charge of society because they were better people. And they were they had more capability of controlling their own sin and controlling everybody else's sin. And so God put aristocrats in charge, and you don't question that. And God put the king in charge of the aristocrats. You don't question that. Right? And ultimately, medieval political theory said that the purpose of government was to protect society from outsiders, but also to enforce laws to prevent sin. And so government had to, for instance, punish heretics who were spreading the wrong ideas about religion. They had to punish adulterers and people who had sex outside of marriage because that's immoral, right? So government's job is to basically police morality to help create a society where people sin the least. And in a positive sense, the best positive spin on this, they're trying to get everybody into heaven by preventing them from sinning. Okay. So in the medieval political theory, society is the way that it is because God created it. God shaped it. God made it the way he wanted it. But a whole bunch of things happened in the 1500s and 1600s which made people decide this political theory was not really workable anymore. In particular, what happened was the Reformation. And the Reformation, Christians began to fight with each other about, the Catholic Church was fairly unified. Everybody was basically Catholic in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. But the Reformation emerges in 1517, and you get a number of groups in Northern Europe break away from the Catholic Church. They say the Catholic Church is corrupt, and we won't be part of it anymore, and a real good Christianity, you have to go back to the roots of Christianity. We're going to do that. And the Catholic Church said, no, we are the tradition of Christianity, and you are heretics, you are wrong. And this led to religious wars. And there were a whole series of religious wars in various parts of Europe throughout the 1500s and the early 1600s. And the net result of the religious wars is a whole lot of people died. But one of the results also was that people realized that if they connected government to religion, they were setting themselves up for almost permanent warfare, because if people disagreed about religion, they were not going to obey the government, and they were going to try to overthrow the government as long as they thought the government was an expression of religion. So, especially in England had a long, nasty civil war that was both religious and about government structures in the 1600s. And basically, a lot of people in England began to ask, is there some way we could construct a government everyone could agree upon that was not tied to the religion, because we don't agree on the religion. And it would be really nice if we could set religion aside and say everyone has their own religion, that's great, but it has nothing to do with government, so we can all agree on the government. So, a number of political thinkers in England began to focus on how can we talk about government in a way that doesn't rely on religion or a church or God. Because we can't agree on religion, church, and God, so if we want to agree on government, we have to have something else. Well, the first to do this was Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes was actually, the part of the English Civil War was the king versus parliament. Who's actually in charge, the king or parliament? Well, Hobbes sided with the king. And so Hobbes wanted to come up with a reason why everyone had to obey the king that didn't revolve around saying God wanted the king to be king. So Hobbes said, well, let's do a thought experiment. And this is a very Enlightenment thing. Now, Hobbes was writing in the 1600s, so he's technically before the Enlightenment. But he's doing a very Enlightenment thing here. He says, let's do a thought experiment. Let's do a rational experiment, sort of like a scientific experiment. Let's pretend that we can go back to look at human beings before society. And we're going to look at just what human beings are like. What are human beings like? And then we're going to say, based on that scientific knowledge of what human beings are like, can we construct a government that's perfect for human beings, that's not based on God, but just based on what a rational interpretation of what human nature is. So Hobbes said, well, let's go back and imagine what people are like. And basically Hobbes said, before society, there were no laws, and so it was a war of everybody against everybody. Everyone was murdering each other and stealing each other's stuff, and nobody had any security because they could never be sure somebody wasn't going to show up and beat them up and take their stuff or kill them. And so Hobbes said, before society, life was, this is his famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. And so Hobbes said, well, how do you get out of this? Well, he said what naturally happens then is some people get together and they decide that they're going to form what we would call a mutual defense pact. We'll all protect each other, right? We'll form a group and we'll agree to all protect each other. And Hobbes calls this Leviathan. You're going to make this huge single person who acts as one person. It's a whole bunch of people, but it acts as one person. But Hobbes said for this to really work, you can't have everybody can't work together if everyone has their own opinion. So you have to put one person in charge. And here Hobbes is clearly leaning towards monarchy. He says you have to put one person in charge. And in particular, he said that person is in charge of defending the group. Right? That's his whole job. The government's whole job is to protect your life. But he said, to do that, government has to have resources, and government has to have access to everything. And so government really has to be able to take your property or take your liberty or make you do things to save your life. And in fact, nobody can really decide what's necessary for defending society except the person you put in charge. Otherwise, they'll be arguing about everything. And so you have to have absolute obedience to the one person who's in charge. You can see how Hobbes is clearly trying to develop a theory of monarchy here. But he basically says that's what society is then. Everybody agrees that they're going to join the group to get protection and safety. But to do that, you have to give absolute power to the king to do whatever he thinks is necessary to protect the group, even if that means locking you up or taking your property or what have you. The king has absolute power. Okay, so that's Hobbes's move, is to say, let's look at human nature by trying to imagine what human beings are like before society, and then we'll try to build a society that fits that. Well, somebody else in the English Civil War, John Locke, did not agree with Hobbes. Locke was actually on the side of Parliament in the Civil War, so he wanted an explanation for why you needed a parliamentary government and not an absolute monarch. But he thought Hobbes had a good idea. Let's go back and look at human beings as they are in a state of nature, so to speak, and then build a society around that. So Locke's idea was, hey, let's go back. And he says, if you imagine society, Locke imagines a whole bunch of people who are just sort of quietly farming and developing orchards and making clothing and whatever. He said, but just like Hobbes, he says, this is dangerous because if somebody comes along, they can steal your stuff. And so he said, people get together and they form what's called the social contract, where they agree that they're all going to work together. But here's where Locke differs from Hobbes. Locke says, yes, it's supposed to protect your life. It's supposed to protect you from other people. But nobody wants to live in a society where people can take your stuff all the time. So that's not going to work. Instead, you have to have a government that protects three things. And Locke says, life, liberty, and property. So a government is there to protect your life, your liberty, and your property. And so Locke says, well, what does that kind of government look like? He says, well, a government that really is there to protect your liberty and your property, you have to have some say there, right? And so he says, Hobbes giving all the power to one person is crazy. Nobody's going to want to live in that. And it won't protect your liberty. Hobbes won't protect your liberty or your property. So instead, Locke says what you need is a legislature. The people who get together and form the government have to also be in the government as a voting body, a legislature. And Locke says the legislature, because it represents the people who made up the social contract, is the highest body in the government. Now, that legislature can appoint someone to be an executive officer, a prime minister or something, or even a king, but the legislature has to ultimately have power because the social contract is about the government serving the people who made the government, and the legislature is represents those people, so the legislature has to have the most say in the government. And in fact, Locke goes even a little further. He says, if the government starts to infringe on anybody's life, liberty, or property, the people have the right to rebel against that government, overthrow it, and make a better one. So Locke ultimately says the government only has power, doesn't have absolute power, doesn't have complete power. The government has very limited power. It's there to do three specific things to protect life, liberty, and property. And it has to answer to the people who formed the government in the first place, and therefore it can be revoked. The government can be overthrown. I should point out, Locke was really the inspiration for the American Revolution. You can see that, the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's clearly echoing Locke, right? So Locke was writing in the late 1600s. He's often seen as one of the first figures of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is roughly the 1700s, but Locke is writing in the late 1680s, was seen as a sort of one of the founding members of the Enlightenment, so to speak, one of the founding thinkers. Well, that's where it stood until Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Well, I should take it back. There were a number of Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu who developed ideas about political theory, about the separation of powers in the government between a legislature, an executive, and a judicial branch. Montesquieu tried to analyze different forms of government, such as monarchies, or what he calls aristocracies, or oligarchies, or democracies. and he tried to analyze how each government functioned. So lots of good political theory came out of that. And there were lots of other people in the Enlightenment who talked about political theory. In fact, one train of thought in the Enlightenment was from people like Voltaire, was that they were following Plato. You know, Plato had written a book called The Republic, which ironically doesn't propose a republic. It instead says the way to make a happy society is to take a philosopher and make him king, because a philosopher really understands what goodness is and what morality is and what a society should be like. If you give him absolute power, he'll make a perfect society. Well, a number of people in the Enlightenment said, well, that's not a bad idea. Why don't we take someone who's enlightened, who really understands science and reason and the good of society, and let's make them a dictator. They called this enlightened despotism. They said if you put a scientific person in charge of everything who's really rational, they'll create a perfectly rational society. And so some people in the Enlightenment, like Voltaire, argued for an enlightened despotism. And they even pointed to certain kings like Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was very much an enlightened guy who read all these Enlightenment thinkers, and and they said he's the model for an enlightened despot. Let's all try to get kings like that. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a different idea. And Rousseau's ideas are really the ones we're concerned with for the French Revolution. And Furet really points to Rousseau as a key part of the revolution. Well, Rousseau's ideas are kind of interesting. I mentioned before that one of the things in the Enlightenment was the idea you're going to wipe away all preconceived notions, and you can do everything rationally, and you're going to create a better society, a perfect society through science. And so one of the key founding ideas of the Enlightenment was that human beings, by applying reason, can make things better over time. And so progress is not only possible, it's inevitable. Because human beings are rational. As long as they keep applying ideas, they're going to make things better. Right? They're going to make new scientific discoveries. They're going to figure out better ways to organize society, etc. So one of the really founding ideas of the Enlightenment was that society is built on progress, and society will constantly be getting better. Well, Rousseau actually really blew a hole in that argument. He basically said, he wrote an essay called On the Origin of Inequality, and he said, let's go back and let's do Hobbes's thing again. Let's look at human beings in a state of nature and see what they're like. And Rousseau was kind of interesting. He did not see, Locke had imagined human beings were like these little farmers creating a nice little world and making stuff for themselves. Rousseau says, no. Human beings, and Hobbes said, human beings are running around killing each other and fighting all the time. It's a war of all against all. Rousseau said, you're both wrong. Human beings in a state of nature basically have interest in just a few things: sex, food, and comfort. Okay? And so human beings, as Rousseau imagines them, sort of just wander around through nature. If they find some food, great, they eat it and they're happy. If they find someone to have sex with, great, they're happy. If they can find a tree to lie down under, they're happy. They don't really need possessions. They don't really want anything. They're happy. And the phrase that people use to talk about Rousseau's vision is the noble savage. Because Rousseau said actually that people in a state of nature are pretty good. They're not naturally evil. They're not trying to kill each other. They're not trying to hurt each other. They only will try to hurt each other if somebody's hurting them. And in fact, he said they have a natural sense of compassion and a natural sense of empathy, and it bothers them when somebody else is hurting, and they'll help them. But Rousseau is very clear that this sort of humanity is pretty simple also. They don't really use language much. They can't think very clearly. They are more or less rational, but they're very simple. Okay? But Rousseau said that at one point, some human being, invented property. They invented the idea that they could put, as Rousseau put it, mark off a piece of land and say to all the other human beings, this is mine, you can't touch it. And Rousseau says, once somebody did that and found other people who were willing to agree to it, society was born. So Rousseau really says society has started not with a social contract and an agreement like to create a government, but rather society is created with property. But Rousseau says once you have property, especially land that you can't carry with you, you need to protect that somehow. You need to convince other people to respect your claim to that piece of land, to not go on that land and take the food off of it. And so this, Rousseau says, leads to people trying to protect their piece of land, which leads to them feeling like they need to band together to protect each other's land, which leads to the creation of governments. And Rousseau says basically government was created as a way of protecting private property. That's its purpose. And, Locke had sort of hinted at this. Rousseau says it outright. Government is created to just protect property. But Rousseau says this is a downward slide. This is actually a bad idea because once you have property, some people are going to have more property and some people are going to have less property. And once you have government, it's there to protect property. So government is going to value the people who have more property and not value people who have less property. It's going to see the people who have less property as a threat to the people who have property. And government's job is to protect property, so its job is to protect the rich people. And Rousseau says that's horrible. And what happens then is you get this horrible sort of snowball of effects of property. Because once you have some rich people and some poor people, the poor people are going to try to either steal from the rich, and then you have government arresting people and locking people up and punishing people and hurting people, or people are going to try to get the rich to give them some of their property. So you start to get people flattering the rich people and trying to hang on to the rich people and take, and get them to give some of their property. And you start to get power structures, and people start to fawn on rich people and orbit around rich people and give rich people power and authority and serve rich people. And you start to get all this inequality in society, and you start to get people trying to compete for status and the attention of rich people, and you start to get all sorts of the horrible flattery and the insincerity of modern society, and you got all the sorts of fashion trends as people try to show off that they're rich or they're not rich. You get all the horrible aspects of society that come out of this. Well, Rousseau says, what do you do about that? Here we are. We can't really imagine where we don't have private property anymore and just go back. What do we do? So in a work called On Social Contract, Rousseau came up with this idea. He said, here's the trick. Everybody wants their own property. Everyone wants the government to protect their own property, but that creates inequality. Right? Everybody also wants complete freedom. But if we're going to start protecting property and things, we're going to start limiting people's freedom because they're going to say, you can't do that, you can't do that. And so he says, how can we have it so that you get all the protection of your property from being part of the group, but you don't have to give up any of your freedom to be part of the group? He says, that's the real conundrum. Because it seems like we invented private property, we invented government to protect that, but everybody lost freedom in that process. And back when we didn't have property, we had freedom, but we didn't have any property. So Rousseau says, how can we have both freedom and property? And Rousseau's idea is that, well, let's have government founded on a social contract. And we'll have everybody come together and make an agreement. But Rousseau's agreement is like this. He says, everybody has to agree that they are going to give the group power over their life and property and everything. The group can do anything. But everyone agrees in the group that every single person in the group has a voice in what the group does, and the group can do nothing against an individual. Any rule the group passes has to apply to everyone equally. So as long as every rule the group passes applies to everyone equally, and every person has a voice in the rules the group passes, nobody is going to agree to a rule that is going to do things to them that they don't like. All right? So Rousseau says that's the key. He says once you set up that, you've set up a society where everyone can have complete freedom but also complete protection of their property. And Rousseau says, but for this system to really work, there's a couple things you need. And one of the things you need is an idea that Rousseau called virtue. And it's an idea that many people in the Enlightenment had sort of taken from the Roman Empire. It's the idea of a person saying, I understand that I need to put the good of the group above my good as an individual. And the reasoning for this is there are things that could happen in the group that would help me as an individual, but they might undermine the group as a whole. And then if the group fails, I'm much worse off because there's nobody protecting my property. So what I need to recognize is that if the group is flourishing, I'm going to flourish as an individual. And so in the short term, I might have to give up something in order to flourish as an individual. I might have to pay taxes or something. But in the long run, I get more benefit from having the group flourish than I give up as an individual to make the group flourish. And so Rousseau says, as long as you recognize that, as long as you recognize that what's good for the group is good for you, and you act on that, you have political virtue. And as long as enough people have political virtue, the government will survive and function well, Rousseau says. And so, in practical terms, I just mentioned taxes. Rousseau says that, a rule could come before the group. We're going to raise taxes in order to buy weapons to defend the group. And Rousseau said every rule the group passes has to apply to everybody. So the taxes have to apply to everybody. So each person is going to, let's say vote, although Rousseau didn't want that. Each person is going to vote on whether or not they want taxes. Well, each individual is going to say, well, I don't want to pay taxes. That's money out of my pocket. But if they're selfish, they're going to, or short-sighted, they're going to say, well, I don't want the tax. I'm going to vote against that. But if they have virtue, if they're thinking about what's good for the group, they'll say, you know what? Having the group have this money to protect everybody protects all of my property. And so, yes, I'm out my tax money at first, but I gain so much in having the rest of my property protected that this is worth it. So they see that as long as they see that what's good for the group is good for them in the long run, and they're going to vote for the taxes. Okay? So that's how Rousseau sees this idea of virtue working. Now, I just mentioned voting. Rousseau actually doesn't think there's voting. What he actually says is that if every person in a group honestly wants what's good for the group, and they honestly realize that what's good for the group, even if it's bad for them as an individual in the short term, is good for them in the long term. If they honestly realize that what's good for the group is good for them, and they honestly think clearly and rationally about what's good for the group, Rousseau argues there really shouldn't be any disagreement. That if everyone's being perfectly rational, and they're thinking about what's good for the group, they should all come to the same conclusion, because it should be obvious to a rational person what's good for the group. Now, this is a blind spot of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment tended to think of reason as a universal thing. They tended to think of reason kind of like mathematics. If you gave an algebra problem to people in China and Latin America and North America and Africa, and they all understood algebra, they would all come up with the right answer, right? They'd all come up with the same answer. Well, in the Enlightenment, they thought reason worked that way. They thought that it was just like mathematics. You do the problem and you come up with the right answer if you're being rational. And so for the Enlightenment, they said if you don't get the right answer, or you get a different answer, you're being irrational, right? And so Rousseau is buying this idea, and he's saying essentially, if everyone wants what's good for the group, and they're being rational, they should all come up with the same answer, what's good for the group. And Rousseau called this the general will. He said the general will should be this consensus about what the group needs to do, what's good for the group, that should just emerge. If everybody has virtue, meaning they all want what's good for the group, and everyone is being rational, there won't need to be votes, because everyone will just agree. Right? And so Rousseau has this idea of the general will that's really a very powerful idea. But this is going to be an interesting problem in the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. Because how do you handle disagreement in the French Revolution? Right? If you assume that there is a general will, and that every person who wants what's good for the group is going to come up with the same answer, how do you deal with disagreement? How do you deal with people saying we should do this and we should do that? How do you deal with people who don't agree? That's going to be a problem. And this is where Furet says, remember that Furet argued that basically the French state just collapses in bankruptcy, and there's a vacuum. All the people who step up to run the government in the National Assembly, they have no experience of government, but they've read their Rousseau. And so they all have these assumptions about how it's going to work. They're going to assume that as long as everyone wants what's good for the nation of France, they should all agree and everything should go smoothly. And then they don't know how to handle conflict. Right? So that's the Enlightenment in a nutshell. And that's Rousseau in a nutshell. And that's how that fits into Furet. So overall, we'll have to keep in mind in this course, how much does the Enlightenment have a role to play in how the French Revolution goes? Some people have said the Enlightenment has very little to do with it. The Marxists basically say the Enlightenment has nothing to do with it. It's all about economic class conflict. Other people like Furet says the Enlightenment is very much a part of it, right? Other people like Daniel Mornay, a French historian, says the Enlightenment basically caused the French Revolution. And then other people are going to say, well, it really wasn't very important, right? So let's pay attention to this. Let's see how it plays out. Keep this in mind over the time, is how much does the Enlightenment shape the French Revolution? So we'll talk about that as the course goes on.